Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts. Another summer 2019 bonus episode. This is not typically what I was planning on putting into a bonus episode because it's going to have a lot of good content in it, hopefully. But then if it sucks, I can blame it on a bonus episode and I can just turn it off. So I just finished a film, and I'm starting on a new one, and the new one's going to be way more complex than the previous one. Very science fiction, very in the future, hopefully really entertaining, but it's very complex. And so I thought I would go over something they call, well, it's two things, be your style and your tone. Now, I've discussed this with other episodes, and it is something that's like, I don't know who I would name as being a master at this besides someone like a Tarantino type writer. You don't have to like his films, but you have to acknowledge that this dude has style and tone down. Now, he probably has more style than tone. Other films have beautiful tone, which I'm going to define as its overall sort of spiritual frequency as you watch the film. Now, again, Tarantino has amazing talents, and I'm not making this whole thing about him, but he just came to mind as I'm freestyling here. But if you're a writer, especially a film, and this is going to be more for film, some of the things I've said in the past could be used for novels, and you could use this, I suppose, for novels, and this could go for TV, obviously, and, you know, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of amazing writers all over the world. Sadly, they don't make a lot of videos, so you don't get a lot of their information. And if they do, they charge money in a college. And I support them 100% doing that because their talents are so refined and so amazing that they earn it. They should get paid for what they do. And I have paid some of them, you know, for these online video things. I mainly stick with Robert McKee. He has a website called Storylog. And he is an amazing teacher, but he is also very, he's very brutal in his methodologies. And he sees it clearly, and sometimes he sees it so clearly that he explains it only in one way. And I suppose if you were his friend and you sat down, he would, if you had a hard time understanding any one of his concepts, he'd probably smooth it out for you. But, you know, he's got to pick his way to make it happen. What's cool about the Screenwriting series / playlist on YouTube or keyworded on another service is that I'm coming at this over and over again, a bit like I do with the moon missions, right? We go at it from different angles, and hopefully if you didn't get it from a previous episode, maybe the next episode will be the one that really clicks for you. But what am I talking about here? Well, if you get into screenwriting, what's interesting about it is, again, just like I mentioned in all my other episodes, there are the fundamental mechanics of writing that you have to master first. I mean, you have to get to your first level of master, meaning if this was some sort of martial arts, this would be your first black belt. And then there's like, you know, infinite degrees of black belt. Well, in writing, there are infinite belts for your understanding of how to craft a story. First, obviously developing some sort of premise, which is your framework. What are we doing here? Where are we? What time are we? Who are your main characters? What's going on here? What is the mechanics of what you're doing? And then, of course, you have to put the story inside of this frame to make it mean something to someone. If I showed you a race car, and it's a beautiful race car, it's got it's right out of like Cannonball. It's got some blown, 429 Hemi. It's got plush seats. It looks awesome. Paint job. It's whatever car you want it to be. And I show it to you and I say, what do you think about that? And you're like, man, that's great. But then you look at me and eventually we just stare at it so long. You look at me and you go, well, what's it for? What are you going to do with it? That's where the story introduces itself. And I say, here, you know what we're going to do with this? And he's like, what? You and I are going to get in this thing and we're going to cross the United States. Except we're going to go back in time. And it's going to be 1975. But we have the spoiled mentality of 2019. And you're going to see how amazing this country was back in that time frame. And then that's the setup. When you go straight into that, we pop out 1979 and we start bumping into Hell's Angels and all kinds of crazy other factors and conflicts. And we get chased and we bump into AC/DC touring from Australia. You know, whatever. And the story develops. I fall in love with someone, you fall in love with someone. There's a story. But now, there's two sides of this episode I want to get into. I don't really have it terribly organized in my mind. I thought about this about 5 minutes ago. But they'll tell you that your style is really recognized in two different ways. There is a style that the audience will recognize when you see a Tarantino movie. And what is that style? It would be the dialogue between Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta in a car discussing what McDonald's is like in Europe. The Grand Royale discussion. That style of communication runs throughout every single Tarantino film. No matter what film he writes, his dialogue is captivating. Interesting. You are dying to hear people talk. From a Nazi talking and being really just creepy as shit as he lights a cigarette or whatever with his lighter and he's just everything's this orchestrated thing. The two guys talking about what's in a suitcase. The brother has style. But then there's a second tier of the style that the audience doesn't see. And this is, I'm being very literal here, and that is the way that the script is written, in which the agent, the studio, received it and read it and was so captivated by its masterful writing that they escalated a piece of paper up to the point of spending 10, 50, 100 to $200 million on a production. They brought together hundreds of people, if not 1,000 people, to make a film. Think about your average Luc Besson film. How many people work on his films? How much money he spends? Was it Valerian? I can't find the number of how much money he spent on that movie. No one will say, and he won't admit it. It looks like they spent gobs of money on this film. So that script, regardless if you like the film, the script had to be powerful enough to get made. Think about James Cameron making his avatars. Now, he's totally in control of his world because he made damn near infinite money off his films. He has the two top grossing films in the world, Avatar and Titanic, right? Style is something that's really rough to acquire. And what's interesting about that is that it sort of harkens back to that conversation. I think it was about 1994, and Steve Jobs is being interviewed on a sofa. And he was being interviewed about Bill Gates, and he still hadn't resolved his emotions towards Bill at that time. Luckily, he did before before the century was out. They had resolved their differences. But he just said, I don't think Bill has any style. Windows doesn't have any style. Apple products have style. The next computer has style. And either you're born with it or you're not. Now, I don't know if that's true in terms of being born with it or not. I have a fear that it's not a matter of being born with it. It's a matter of being raised with it. And what's interesting is it is a very strange thing because I remember I'll give you two segments. The second experience I had, I'll give you the first after the second for very specific reasons, My father has style. It doesn't matter if he didn't make $1 billion in his lifetime or whatever, but my father has style, man. He knows what clothing looks cool, and he looks sharp and tough, and not tough in a insecure way, but just really just Tom Hardy in a suit. That kind of like, damn, that looks cool, and you want to emulate that. You look at a really badass car. My father loved Macintosh stereo equipment back in the 70s, and there's just no denying that stereo back in the 70s was beyond cool looking. Everything we had just looked cool. My father listened to music that I think had that upper echelon of enlightenment, your Pink Floyds. He liked Deep Purple. So people that were grooving with all the rest. And it's not that he disliked anything in between. It's just some stuck out and some became his favorites. Kraftwerk and Queen and Led Zeppelin. Just the best of the best. It had style. When I saw Tron, like I said, 1982, I looked at that movie and my mind was blown for every single reason in the book, from the overall tone of the movie, which we're going to get into, the style of the Sid Mead artwork and the Mobius artwork. But Sid Mead stuff hit me in my soul. It was something to do with like the Legos of God, is what Sid uses to build all of his designs. Sid is pure, concentrated, futuristic style. That guy could take a paperclip and redesign it, and it will look better, and it will look cool, and it will look like it came 100 years from the future, because he has style. Now, the other thing, because I hate saying things like you're either born with it or not, because you might feel you're not born with it, and then you might give up. There might be techniques to stimulate this. There might be techniques for you to evaluate this. I was born with a really old soul. And I'm not telling you that to do like some backhanded boasting. I need you to understand that the reason why I know I was born with a really old soul was I didn't like being a little kid. I just thought everything was stupid. I just thought, oh my God, like singing. I've told you this in many episodes if you're a long-time listener, but nursery rhymes just gagged me to death. I dug some of my toys, but as soon as like Legos came around, I was like, oh yeah, now we can build something that kind of looks sophisticated at least. But I always dug the adult things around me. I didn't want to do what they did to be a grown up necessarily. I didn't want to be grown up, like physically grown up. I just, in my brain, I was content being 3. I just, I was ready for Sid Mead. The minute I was born, it was interesting. I was drawn to things that were very stylish. The films that I ended up falling in love with ended up being cult classics, right? I fell in love with Tron, but Tron was panned when it came out. Disney, this is hilarious backstory. Disney's president, after Tron was released, he wasn't there when it was approved and put together, but he was the president shortly after it released. He tried to have all of its material, all of its source burned. And one of these guys who worked on it found a guy burning the original materials of the film in a barrel behind a warehouse, and he's like, what are you doing? This is my film. I don't know, I've just been told to burn this. I don't know what it is. Guy hadn't even seen Tron. So he said, stop burning the goddamn film. I'm going to bring my car around, and we're going to stick it in my car. So the guy made 4 or 5 trips and got it all saved. They lost most of the artwork, and now they're running around yelling at people who worked on the film, do you have the artwork? And everyone's like, no, maybe you burned it, you idiots. Like, don't blame us for not having the archives, But Blade Runner, another great film. Everybody panned it. Harrison Ford hated being on the film because he didn't like being cold and wet, and he didn't like the way that Ridley Scott directed. This has all been resolved. But it stood the test of time. I remember walking around for 20 years after that film released and going, well, haven't you seen Blade Runner? What the hell's that? I don't know. And now it's like, it's the bomb film. amazing. The sequel, shit, okay? I can't even tell you. The music's fantastic. A lot of the special effects are the only places where you see Blade Runner type scenes, because the visual effects studios understood Blade Runner and understood where the camera should be placed and how the scene should look. They preserve the style. But the director of that film, he couldn't light a scene enough, right? Unbelievable. My opinion, of course. But I fear that this programming for style, which is important in your script, it's a requirement to really get noticed when you write. And you'll work on it your whole life. You will work on it your whole life, but you will hit a sweet spot where people start noticing it. My co-host from MK Ultra Radio, a show that's now gone. Very few people know it, but he is a novelist. He's dabbled in screenwriting quite successfully now, but we met at a creative writing class, and his style was, and is, I don't think he writes anymore, but he is a master novelist. He makes Stephen King lay down and take a nap. With one sentence, your mind is so utterly blown and fulfilled. I used to pull out scripts when I got a new girlfriend. I pull out one of his scripts and said, I got to read you one of these stories my buddy Kyle wrote. And I just read 4 or 5 sentences, and these girls would just look at me like, who's writing this? This is like getting a little excited about Kyle's writing style. So there's styles within the action and the setups of your scenes, and then there's the prose, the dialogue. Obviously, you can be probably, if you're more apt to write real stylistic prose, the dialogue, you'll probably be forgiven for not writing tremendously interesting and optimized action. But I'm going to go through this with you guys so that you understand how meticulous this could be. Because this should be fun. If you're a writer, it's because you have to be. You got stories falling out of your brain, and you're just trying to save all your children. You have to get these stories out, because even if you write a film and it doesn't get made, but you wrote it, it's there for time, for the annals of time. You may not get paid for it or whatever, but if you care about your children, you care more about them existing and being healthy than you making some money off of them, right? Like these parents that try to push their kids into, celebrity pastimes so they can make money off their children. It may work, but it's not the right way to raise a kid, most likely. Now we've had Tiger Woods, we've had Mozart, because parents do this, and they're not necessarily. Poor Mozart died penniless, but Tiger's probably pretty happy his father forced it on him. And there's millions of people who went through this who aren't necessarily technically household words, but they have the same story, the same beginning, the same childhood. But let's break it down. I'm going to start with the action side of things in your script, because there are words that make people feel certain ways. I try to use them on this show. Now, the benefit that I get is that I get to talk and use my voice tone, my attack and decay, my beginning, middle, and end inflections on how I say things to either make you excited, make you maybe a little upset, or to calm you down and make you want to go to sleep. But when you hand in a script, you're not there to read it. And there are people that will read a script and get very little from it because they don't read scripts that often. They don't know how to put their personal spin on things. And so you need to help them figure out how to read your script. And tone's going to play a huge role in this. And tone's really where you get the curves and things. But if any of you have read a book like Catcher in the Rye, and then you've read a Tom Clancy novel, or just, I would say, a regular novel, you know there's a gigantic difference in how they're written. One book is cussing up a storm so badly the book gets banned all over the place. And one is telling an old-fashioned story. Okay, depends on what you're into. Maybe you want a real gritty Stephen King novel from the 80s, 70s or 80s, or maybe you want Bridges over Madison County, or whatever it is. a real warm sort of Norman Rockwell style and tone. So the way I'm going to present this to you, with an action between style and tone, is that it sort of goes in I think a coarse brush style and a fine brush tone. One of the physical ways I can describe this to you is to say if you had someone that built something out of wood or steel, and it's a particular object that needs to perform a function, perhaps a table of some sort. Well, you know a table has to find a way to hit the ground, stand up to waist level, and provide a surface for people to do things on, eat on, whatever. You're going to have a 6'5" guy put his elbows on one side, and you need to make sure the table doesn't fall over. That's why many folks have stuck with a four-legged object. Some will figure out a way to make a pedestal directly in the center that is so perfectly balanced that you could damn near stand on one end of it and you won't topple over. So looking at the table from afar, let's say you stare at the table from 20 feet away, in my opinion, the first element that you will notice is what you call, or what I call, style. How is it constructed? Do the legs go straight down? Do they curve in? Do they curve out? What color is it? If you made it out of wood, is it finished wood? Is it 4 or 5 different woods? Some darks and some lights? Does it have wood and metal in it? Who knows? When you look at IKEA furniture, there's a style to IKEA furniture. Put together, perhaps you create an overall frequency, which you might call your tone. But when you get closer and closer to the table, you will see if there really is a style or tone, or is it merely function with very little form. If you got up close to the table and you realize that it's been rounded off in really beautiful ways, you see the craftsmanship in it. If it's made out of steel, it's brushed steel. It looks amazing. Perhaps there's even some tchotchkes in the table that have nothing more than just a cosmetic aesthetic feature to it. It's simply to give you an emotion. Perhaps you thought it was all made of wood or steel, and when you get up to it, they've inlaid special glass, very special glass. Perhaps it looks like beach glass, some polished, beautiful blue. It almost looks like a crystal surface. Perhaps they embed a backlight on it, so it lights up like some futuristic bar. If somebody said, I've designed my house to use a bunch of retro 50s furniture. Well, one in the 50s, your living room is made out of like 4 or 5 decades, just so you know. But let's say that you do the standard mistake that most people make when they make 50s period films or 40s period films. The set designers run off and just specifically say, nothing in this room if it wasn't made in the 40s, because we're making a 40s film. Not realizing in the 40s you got a radio from 1930s, you've got a commode or some, dish furniture that's made in the 20s, and it just goes back, 30 or 40 years if you have a very recent room. But that's the style. That's the constraint of what could be put in your space. The words that you might choose, the type of language you might use, might be better suited for your style. Do you swear in your action? Are you really frank and it feels like I'm getting this story off someone that is in a bar? I just was traveling and I got really tired. I was walking and I found a saloon and I walked in and I'm just exhausted. So I'm sort of captive to my own exhaustion, and I sit down on a bench in a dark corner. Sunlight's beaming through the window. It's high noon. It's hot out. A little cooler inside. Got the windows and the doors open. Breeze is going. But I can smell somebody. Somebody else is probably sweating like me. Had bathed in a couple days. But they look eccentric, and they notice me. And you make a salutation. How you doing, man? What brings you out here? And he starts to tell you a story. And beyond your expectation, he tells you a story that is unbelievable. The reason why he's there is, he's running from a posse, or he just robbed a bank, or He time traveled, whatever. But he's a gritty guy, and he's just giving it to you because he has no more energy to polish his language. Maybe he's at his end of his rope. It's like, I don't even know what's going to happen to me. I don't even know if I'm going to make it till tomorrow. Maybe I'll blow my brains out. Maybe I'll get hunted and killed. Whoa. It's a different type of story than you expected. It has a style initially, and over the course of ingesting a particular style, the whole experience has a tone. You meet a person. Maybe they're really gentle. They have a beautiful voice. You're in a nice place. Maybe you've had sort of a cranky day or an uncertain day. And however this person speaks to you just makes you feel better. Well, when you're sitting down face to face, eating every second of their dialogue, they have a style they're communicating with you, using it, right? But after you leave or spend time, and if you itemize a certain length of time, it's putting off a tone, an overall feeling, a frequency of the experience. But it's not just the dialogue, is it? Which is why I want to start with the action, the metaphysical in the room of a true real-life experience. If you take the example I just gave you, and I light it up a little bit more, you're in a desert, it's hot, it's windy, it's like a dust bowl, clouds of smoke are blowing by, there's just dust piles, and a tumbleweed bounces off your leg every few seconds. And in the distance, you can barely make out what you think might be a mirage, but it's a building in the middle of nowhere with an old lazy sign on it that says saloon. And you're not even sure it's real. You're not sure that it's open, functional. If anyone's been in it for 100 years, you just don't know. Your feet hurt in your shoes, man, your boots. You're pretty sure some of your feet have worn through your soles and you're just dragging dirt up into your shoe, but you're not sure. It's just one of those moments where your consciousness is flickering. You're so tired and thirsty and maybe hungry. Maybe you lost your hunger because you've been out there for so long. And you get up to the door. It's not even closed. And you can just walk in. And you can't believe it's open. And you walk in, and to your total surprise, there's 4 or 5 people in there. And one's a bartender. There's no waitress. And everyone looks up at you, and you think, like, for sure you're going to be considered an invader. This isn't your place. You're a random nomad. Why wouldn't they fear you? But no one does. Just looking at the grit on everyone's face, maybe a scar on someone's body, you know that they believe no matter what you're throwing down, they can handle you. So you pay your respects with a nod. All you want to do is get off your feet. But you have a few gold pieces in your pocket. And you wander up to the bar. And you're pretty sure they don't sell any water. So you get the next best thing. At this point, a little bit of whiskey might take away the pain. Feed your body with some sugar, whatever it is. You grab your drink. And just like trying to pick a urinal in the bathroom, you don't want to stand close to anybody if you don't have to. You don't want any trouble. Find one little lone seat off in the corner. And it's dark, which is exactly what you want. And just stepping on hardwood planks makes your knees ache. You lay down your order. Bartender pulls out a little shot glass, pours you a little splash. You put your gold piece on the bar. And you know it's worth way more than a single drink, and so does he. So he hands you the bottle. It's half empty. You grab it, and you wander over to the corner. And you sit down. And every single piece of sand you crush under your boot sounds like a sonic boom in that room. All eyes are on you. And all you want to do is curl up in a ball and drink your drink and have nobody know you're there. That was a very smooth example of which should probably have a little bit more style. But you see the story, right? If I'm telling that story, I just gave it to you in a modern language format. But what I might need to do is, quite frankly, in real life, if I haven't read a Western book, either written very authentically to the language and the actual vocabulary of the time, maybe I need like a Deadwood has a beautiful style to it. All the dialogue's phenomenal. And if you're writing some of that dialogue in a particular way with a particular sensibility, you might start writing your action to feel like this manuscript was pulled out of that time frame. Let them feel like it's a treasure map. You don't want to get silly with it, but you probably want to start using some language that would feel like you're actually in that time frame, depending on what time frame we're talking about. But now, I haven't told you really what the place looks like inside, have I? Maybe I did such a good job describing that. It's better I don't pick things to take away your imagination. Because once I start explaining everything, I'm removing perhaps a better story in your mind. Directors will eventually get scripts to decide whether or not they want to make them. Agents are supposed to have the same skill set of the directors in terms of imagining the basics of how the script might be realized. Whether or not an audience would feel the way that the writer wants them to feel. The more style you have, the more that you're going to accurately paint in the mind of the reader prior to getting anything on film what could be put on the silver screen. But our character wanders over and sits down in the corner. Sometimes it's very useful to think beyond the obvious and to note something that would be happening that the average writer or person wouldn't note. The fact that his feet might have, been so out there in the desert that it has worn through his soles. And for a split second, we see him look down at his boot, and there's his foot coming right through his boot. I mean, he's screwed. He needs some new boots. No matter where he goes, he's going to look funny with half of his foot hanging out of the bottom of his boot. The fact that his body hurts. Little nuances that mean something, that tell way more than you've actually told. If you have a guy coming out of a desert and he has all these ailments, then you're going to imagine, how did this person get there in the first place? When the show from HBO, Carnival, starts, Nick Stahl's character eventually, right in the very beginning of the film, has to bury his mother. And when the Carnival shows up randomly to see what's going on, and one of them comes out to see him, and then they all come out to help him as he's trying to bury his mother in this horrible windstorm. They notice he's got a chain around his ankle. He's been in a chain gang, which I believe they did film when he was inside the house trying to take care of his mom. Well, that's a whole backstory. And you know what? That backstory is never explained as far as I remember. I just started rewatching it the other day, just for the hell of it. I've seen it 5 times. It's just masterful, man. But it adds dimension to your character. But if you're going to set something in the Dust Bowl of America in the 1930s, there was a way that they spoke, and your script should probably reflect that. When I wrote the movie for Cuchulainn, my initial treatment, which was like a full-blown script, but I wrote it in a very fairy tale fashion on purpose to see how flowery I could make it from that era without getting too sort of overachieving, And it wasn't until I saw like 11 in my method of telling the story did I realize, okay, I've seen 0 and I've seen 11, so now I need to pull it back to a solid 8.5, 9 in the way that I'm going to borrow language that would be sort of spiritually in the style of perhaps how their language might have been more primitive or more spiritual. Again, you're talking about human beings that would have probably believed a lot of things that we don't believe today, and we'll never really know what people believed in 2500 BC. But go back to our bar. In the middle of nowhere, in a time frame that we're unsure about. This could be apocalyptic future, like a gunslinger series out of Stephen King, or shit, man, it could be somewhere in the 1850s. You don't know, and that's intriguing. And that style of writing, to leave a little bit of empty space, is alluring. The less you know about something, the more you're interested in it. Your movie star, or your singer, or musician, I should say, who is doing a tell-all constantly in People magazine, constantly taking, 12 interviews a year, if not 24 interviews a year. You're not as interested in that person as you are someone who's very secretive. Stanley Kubrick was very private when he learned the press lies after an interview and says whatever they want to say and claims that they've quoted him. Prince had the same exact experience. They also happened to be the masters of their art, the top of their very genre. And so the more mysterious they were, the more society wanted to know. And that became a marketing mechanism for Prince and a curse for someone like Stanley Kubrick, who just wanted you to see his films. He didn't want you involved in his personal life. But the more time passes in your scenes, in your sequences, the more you're going to give off this constant frequency. Wom, 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 wom. And that little chant of the words that you use, as long as you have a style, which is a constraint on the language that you're going to use in your script for that particular script, it's going to develop a frequency that we know as tone, and that's my designation of it. And that is so very important. How many of you have seen Stranger Things? Stranger Things constrained themselves, to the 80s. And the brothers that do that show, they understood the 80s exceptionally well, which is kind of interesting because I think they're at least half a decade, if not a decade, younger than myself, which means they were literally born into the first year of the 80s. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but they understand the 80s beautifully. I just started season 3, which kind of prompted this episode. And I will tell you, by the second episode of Stranger Things, season 3, there's an amazing recreation of the 80s. And it's funny because it is a recreation of not only the actual events of the 80s that I experienced as a kid myself, but the sort of Fast Times at Ridgemont High feel of like the Sherman Oaks Mall that has a tone. So it's sort of a caricature uptick of what it used to be. That is masterful writing, masterful directing. The set design is just spot on. It makes me feel over and over and over as I'm watching it second to second like they teleported back to the 80s and did it. It's really amazing, besides everything being HD, But they're doing an amazing job on that show. Now, there'll be different requirements for your style and tone. Some of it may not ever surface in your script. You're a junior writer, hopefully sooner than later going to be more of a expert writer and then a master writer. But let's say you pick something that's very sort of modern day, 2019. You're handing it in. It's a story about 2019, and it's really about the human condition, let's just say. Some romance between two people, some event that is very fantastic in terms of explosions and spaceships coming from somewhere, or time travel, or some crazy, paranormal thing. It's just a beautiful story. Well, in that case, your only style would be to keep it as real as possible. To not say things that people don't say. Because let's face it, if you're a writer, we write things that we never say. Like Robert McKee said, he goes, only assholes use the word utilize. He says that in his class. I think it's funny. And he obviously he's not talking about technical documentation. But technical documentation is not screenwriting. Screenwriting is the real life, portrayed perhaps in an artistic way. In the science fiction piece I'm about to write here, I'm going through the actual scene design right now. It's a script I've been working on for 20 years in the background. It's going to need a very specific style, but more importantly, it's going to need an extremely specific tone. I need to control within my action, and especially my set description of each scene, because there's going to be a lot of exotic locations in this, and I need to work quickly because I don't want to lose a giant portion of my page economy, which is 120 pages, to descriptions of the environments. I also don't want to bore anyone. So if I'm taking a moment out to say, this is the reason, this is the way this room looks, this is the design of the room, the finishes, where the lighting is, to make sure that I paint in your brain what I'm seeing in my head, I got to make it quick. One of the classic things that people will figure out when they're trying to determine their style is, one, you have the style of the narrator, and you are narrating the script between prose, between the dialogue breaks. One of the toughest things you learn and have to learn over time is making sure every character feels like a different person, that they don't all communicate the same way. One of the easier ways to do this is to give each character some specific words that aren't abused, but only that character uses those words. And I'll just give you a little trick. Secretly, you repeat those words in an interval that's far enough apart in their dialogue breaks that no one notices it's repeated consciously, but they subconsciously link those words or phrases to that character. The more you can separate your characters, the more as a reader you will feel phenomenal, or you'll make the reader feel phenomenal in the experience. Because without trying, they will feel like these characters are very separate beings. And if you're starting out, you might actually get a little broad stroke with this technique and create sort of a caricature of your characters. You can always tone back, right? You can go to level 10 or 11 and tone it back. But you make a character that is sort of flamboyantly one way. For instance, in Star Trek, up until you go Next Generation up till Enterprise. At Enterprise, they balanced it out a little bit, and I actually appreciated this. But in Enterprise, in Next Generation, starting in 87, you had this character Riker. And Riker's entire purpose is to be the conflicting force. He loses his cool more often. And they did a good job making him usually very justified, but he will tell you go F yourself pretty quick if you're doing something he thinks is not for the greater interest of the ship. But now think about Picard. Picard was this British refined, well, in real life he's a refined actor, so they wrote the dialogue really in sync with a lot of the acting he had done, from his movie debut in 81 or 83 or whatever Excalibur was made. But he was always the voice of reason, the voice of deep wisdom. Counselor Troy, she was the empath, she was the mother, she was always the one with the soothing perception of what's going on. Then Data was absolutely as monotone as could be, and he simply stated fact as often as he possibly could. And sometimes to an extent that people went, okay, you can stop talking now, right? Worf, coming in as a Klingon. Absolutely a warring race. To die in battle was the honorable way to go. And they were always trying to seek that story arc to the end of their life. Beautiful, individual, stylistic design. And as a writer of that show, obviously I never wrote for that show, but it must have been easier to distinguish what each character would say because the differences in their very character design was so distinct. And that's what you want as you are perfecting this thing we call style within the prose of your character. Now, when you get into like Voyager, you have characters that are subtly different in some cases. You have maybe two nice guys. And when two nice guys talk, wow, how do you keep them apart from each other? How do you make them feel like they're different? Well, there's going to be constraints on your character. One character would always do this, and the other character would never think about doing that. So there's personality differences that create this distinction, that define your style. You wouldn't think about a rubber ducky being in the movie Star Wars, would you? That would be a blatant error in the universe of Star Wars. Well, that blatant example of it being completely wrong should give you the guiding principle in your mind of how to find those distinctions in your more subtle differences between characters. One of the tricks I use when writing my scene setups and then my action is I try to think of someone, even if it's faceless, it's not an actor, but some of you might want to pick an actor or pick some personality. Maybe you have an Orson Welles in mind who's telling your story. Maybe it's Morgan Freeman's telling your story. Whoever, keep that character in mind. Give that narrator a constraint to define what would be said, how it would be said over time. You know that if Orson Welles read any book to you, especially like the old classics, Tom Sawyer or a Charles Dickens novel, it would feel big and amazing. Just his voice and the way he would read it to you would be phenomenal. Well, hand the same books to Robin Williams and have him read it to you. It would be a whole different experience, wouldn't it? Even if the words are constrained on the page, just their delivery would make it completely different. But that's not the way it is. They, in your script, will choose the words. They're reading what actually took place, and then they're turning to you and paraphrasing it in their own language. And over time, you're going to get an Orson Welles tone that hopefully is your goal, if that's what you're looking for. Now, I am making this episode because what I'm about to head into is going to be heavily constrained by, or I should say, its success will be determined almost ultimately by, obviously, me putting together a good premise and a good story. I'm going to assume I can accomplish those broad stroke requirements of writing this particular script. But in the end, it is going to be utterly digested or thrown into the trash based on my style and tone that I'm defining by what I'm writing. So let's talk about so let's do a quick review. When you're talking about the style of your action and your scene setup, because your prose are going to be determined by the constraints you have on your characters, as we just defined. That's a little bit easier. Not always completely easy, but the place where people get, I think, confused, and where I was confused for a decade at least, was how do I make my scene setup and my action have a particular constraint? Let me just throw this at you. Haven't you heard someone speak who you think is articulate? And for whatever reason, the words that they pick are not too big to exhibition, a big vocabulary. They're not trying to brag passively by using giant words. They just sound comfortable. It's almost as if, in my opinion, a well-articulated person, let's put it that way, will be someone who touches synapses in my brain that want to be touched. You know, if you've ever had a massage where people will get into a certain area, your neck or whatever, between your toes or whatever, and it's just like, oh man. And the reason why it feels good, in my opinion, is that no one has touched you there perhaps ever. If ever, they've never done it in the way that it's being done that makes you just melt. And that's what I think a well-written passage or someone who's speaking well feels like. And then you start hearing your perhaps classic movies where someone is, portraying a cowboy from the past. A lot of Twilight Zones have this beautifully done. It's usually not the main character. There's the old Twilight Zone where the cowboy comes back to this town. It's almost exactly that scenario I gave you at the beginning of this episode, but except it's nighttime. And he's coming into this town. The town has a really funny name. I can't remember. But it's like, Happy Town or Niceville or something like that. But he goes to the bar, and he's this rough, tough cowboy. Very famous actors in every single slot. But he comes in, he's fairly well articulated, but he's got a few words that he stumbles on that gives him that cowboy feel. But as he comes into the bar, he's got a whole spread of guys in there, and they know him. And he's supposed to have been tracking down this guy and killing him, but he never got to him. And what he finds out the second he comes in the bar is that the guy he's been tracking and trying to kill or grab and bring home, dead or alive, is already dead and he's out in the graveyard. And so they kind of grief him a little bit and say, you didn't get him, man. You thought you were really tough, And so the script goes on where they're trying to challenge his manhood and whether or not he would go out and visit the grave. I bet you won't go out and visit his grave. And the story is not completely important in this, but each character in that bar is written brilliantly. From absolutely broken English to, I think there's a drunk, there's a kiss-up mayor who just talks 1,000,000 miles a minute, and he's just trying to kiss your ass as much as possible. And then there's this rough, tough sort of Wild Bill dude who's the main guy who's just, he's tired. He doesn't want to hear this crap, and the last thing he's going to put up with is someone questioning his manhood. I don't know if Rod wrote that one. He probably did. But Rod Serling was an absolute master at distinguishing characters. But one of the words I want to stick into your mind, because it is a word that I find is more accurate in its application of writing to achieve this style than any other word I can put in your head. And if you're in a writing block situation about how to massage the words of a particular scene setup, especially your scene setup, or the action that is taking place, is romantic. And I don't mean romantic in a love affair, sort of love story romanticism, but there should be something romantic about how you're putting the words on paper, what words you're choosing. And what I find is the more you loosen your grip on what you're trying to do, the more magic just flows out of you. It's almost as if you were sharing your body with some other celestial being that is a master writer. And if you were to be possessed, let's just say, by some ghost, and they said, look, just stop trying to control your body. I'm going to script on paper a message. And their penmanship, if you don't mess with their penmanship, you don't try to control the hand, you just relax and you just ride along with it. It's going to be the most masterfully written script, easy to read, beautiful, flowery, amazing script. But the more you try to push on top of it, it starts getting scribbly and there's two hands trying to control one hand at one time. A lot of times if you loosen up, that's when this romantic flow will start to occur. And what starts happening is that if you've ever been taught how to dance formally, you put one hand on a shoulder, you hold your hands out, and you're trying to do some waltz or something, any type of step, the more you try to control the situation, you're stepping on the other person's foot. But the more you just relax, calm your soul, the rhythm of the person who knows how to dance, the music itself flows through you, and it's almost as if you were born to do it. And it comes out beautifully. And you may even experience this, which is very interesting. You might feel like you're losing your consciousness a little bit while it's occurring. And then you'll come back to it later. And you'll be like, God, I wrote that last night? I was in the zone, baby. Sometimes you'll be hyper in the zone, and it's the exact inverse experience. You know every single word to write, and it seems as if you are like building a wall out of bricks, and you're laying down the cement and the bricks, and you're a mason, and you're just flying along as you're putting this wall together. And when you get done, it is the best work you've ever done in your life. And the next morning, you remember every brick you put in place. You're like, damn, I'm good. You can have a day like that in a script, and then the other day, you're just clunking along like you don't know how to walk and chew gum at the same time. But then, there's another advanced element to doing either one of these things, which is something you need to be aware of. There is style fatigue, tone fatigue in your script, which is why, as Robert McKee will teach you, again, you got to get his book Story. Just go look up the book called Story by Robert McKee, M-C-K-E-E. He is my teacher, and I hope he'll be your teacher as well. I say get the book on audio and just listen to it to the point you can recite it yourself. But he teaches you about the gap. And I'm not trying to give you a repeat of a lesson I've taught a couple of times in different episodes, but it's important in this discussion. Gaps are things that essentially put obstacles between your character and what your character wants to do. At the beginning of your script, your gaps might be really tiny little things. They wanted to, your character's waking up really tired. And there's this whole ritual of like literally just pulling themselves, and when they hit the clock, they pull themselves out of the bedroom. They're just barely able to brush their teeth. They're going to screw it. They're not going to try to comb their hair yet because they're not really awake. Only one eye's open, the other one's winking. And then they get into the kitchen, and they know they need their coffee to wake up. And it's going to wholly light up your character. And they get the little filter out, and they put it in the coffee maker, and then they open up, they get the bag of coffee, and they pour, and only like 2 drops come out, and it's not enough to make coffee. And they're like, son of a bitch. And without saying a word, you know that character wanted to make coffee, needs to make coffee to get this story going. And if you've ever had a morning like that, you see a guy having a morning like that in a script, and you feel it. You empathize. Now you're involved in the story. Oh man, I've had a morning like that. Wonder what's going to happen next. And of course you go some outrageous thing or whatever you're trying to do. But let's say this script goes from that little coffee making incident, like perhaps the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where Arthur Dent's just waking up trying to brush his teeth before a bulldozer shows up outside and tries to knock his house down to make room for a bypass, of which he's totally unaware of, right? And he ends up lying down in front of a bulldozer in his smoking jacket or his robe or whatever it is, and he's just trying to stop his house from getting torn down. He has to argue with the guy about, what do you think you're doing knocking down my house? And he's like, well, hey, it's all been posted up at the city hall or whatever, and he just starts arguing with the guy, and the gaps get bigger. Eventually, Arthur Dent, within the hour, is on a spaceship. Earth has been destroyed, and I was running around with a guy named Ford Prefect, who's from the constellation Betelgeuse, wondering what he's going to do with the rest of his life. And the story goes on and on and on. It just, the gaps get bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, these gaps and the overall structure of a basic screenplay, they're your friend when it comes to fatigue time. Now, I gave you the example about picking an actor who might be reading the script to you in your mind. You're just really the typist. That's all you're doing. You're transcribing the words that you're hearing out of the universe. But if you have scenes that are mundane, but important and funny, setting up this guy trying to make coffee, but you know that, like Guardians of the Galaxy, maybe 5 seconds later, he's going to be on a different planet, shooting lasers and wondering why he got there because something crazy happened to him. You were going to have a style of telling the low-impact scene and a style of telling a high-impact scene. And you're probably going to have maybe 3 to 4 different species of scenes that you're going to write. And your style is going to determine how those scenes are written. What words are you going to use? You've probably heard, if you study any screenwriting whatsoever, in an action sequence where you need the reader to feel like things are speeding up, you have to choose really small words. That way they read, and then it starts going faster. Because a little 3 to 5 letter words. No big words in an action scene. Try not to do that. But now let me give you an example. You're going to have something like the Matrix happen in a Matrix action scene in your script. There's going to be a super fast dialogue scene where everything's being set up very quickly. Maybe you're doing one of those cliche scenes where the guy's putting all the guns on his body and tightening his belt buckle and combing his hair and put the sunglasses in. And he goes out and gets in a gunfight, and that's going pretty quick. But you want to start bullet time, where everything's slowing down, where Neo leaned back and moved out of the way of all the bullets. Well, you want to slow things down for that, because you're slowing it down inside the camera for the audience. And so maybe you start widening your words. It's a whole different vocabulary when you want to slow down the reader. And as soon as bullet time's over, what do? You speed it back up by using shorter words. But you're going to pick your words extremely careful. Now let me give you a little trick about words. I'm going to give you an analogy. You're driving down the street, main thoroughfare of wherever you live, where there's lots of cars all the time. If you see a bunch of mundane cars, a bunch of cars between the price of maybe $15,000 and say $25,000, American, and all these little cars pass you, probably don't notice them. Probably don't notice them at all. But here comes a Lamborghini, a McLaren, a Ferrari, all top-end models, all tricked out with the full packages, custom paint jobs. The rotors have special colors in them. The interior looks wild. There's interesting people in the cars, or maybe you can't see in the car. Are you going to notice those cars more than all the other cars? Obvious answer is yes. All right. Your words are exactly like these cars. Little teeny tiny words will never be remembered individually by the reader. They're there to communicate an idea and communicate it quickly. If you need the reader to slow down and start to notice some very specific descriptions that you have, you're literally slowing it down. Maybe it's a wide shot in your screenplay. You don't want to necessarily say wide shot. You start using bigger words and perhaps easy to pronounce words that have a little bit more implication to them. They're a little more flowery. They're a little bit multi-dimensional words. If I use the word ubiquitous, that's a fairly interesting word. Some people have never seen it written on paper before. But if I start using that, I'm starting to set the scene for you. Something in the scene is ubiquitous. I don't think I've ever used that word in any of my scripts, but if we did, it'd be very strategic. That word is sitting out there like the Holy Grail. It's sitting out there like a treasure. I want you to notice this word because I want you to apply this word in its meaning. Maybe it's multiple level meaning to what we're doing here. That's obviously a more advanced technique. But you may need that in your quiver sooner than you think. And even if you never pull out that golden arrow out of your quiver, just knowing it's there will make you understand how to use all the other type of arrows you have in your quiver, all the other words that you use. In my science fiction script that I'm about to indulge myself in for a couple months here, I'm going to have to describe very specific sets, like I said, because they're extremely important to how this entire experience will feel to the reader, and hopefully, if it ever makes it to the silver screen, how it will appear. But now I know people like Sid Mead, Oliver Schul, these amazing production designers, and I know that they're burdened with reading the script and translating it into a visual art. First, a storyboard, then the very specifics of how these rooms are designed. And I know if I were to be talking to them as the director, I know how to make words extremely informative to their minds but not constraining to the point where they can't design because I put something very specific in them that they need to ask me a question about. I can put in colors and tones and surfaces. I can talk about whether or not there's sharp edges or smooth edges. What if I told you that there's a room that houses, 10 futuristic machines? They're duplicated. Something's got a factory going, and those machines aren't supposed to exist. But I say, somehow, there are no sharp edges in this room at all. Absent of an edge, something like that. Then now their mind is thinking in smooth turns. Well, where are edges in rooms? Well, a 6-wall room has corners, has the wall meeting the floor, the wall meeting the ceiling. And if I tell that reader / production designer / director that there are no straight edges anywhere in this room, then they start to envision like a well-honed chamber that has been meticulously designed, perhaps. We don't make rooms like that because it's really difficult. So if there were a room like that, it would probably be in the future when machinery can pull that off. Now, we've been dealing with the fairly esoteric notions of the texture of a word as it makes your tongue flip around inside your mouth. That will create a tone. And you have to determine for your language what is going to be considered an awkward word or an easy word. Doesn't matter how many syllables it has. If it runs over smoothly, then the whole experience is a smooth experience. It's a very warm place. They designed Mickey Mouse's body to be very, very soft because corners and sharp edges are what cavemen feared the most, because if you jabbed yourself on one of them, bumped them with your elbow, we didn't have hospitals you could go to or stitches you could get. That could be a fatal cut. You walk through some water and you die. Caveman doesn't understand any of that stuff. He just knows if I break my skin, I've got to really take care of that. I could die. So smooth edges and smooth surfaces are always warm. The bosom of a mother is a smooth thing. They said the 2 ears of Mickey Mouse were designed to look like the breasts of a woman. I don't know if they really intended on doing that, but that's definitely how it feels in the end, isn't it? The Lexus, when the Lexus first came out, the car, the back end of the car was supposed to be the back end of a woman. Smooth. Subliminally soft, so you would feel comforted by it. So that's the metaphysical properties of the words that you choose that are important. But now there are fairly literal, on-point things you can use, which is colors. I once asked my agent, I said, look, do you get many scripts that talk about the music playing in a scene? Because I feel kind of silly saying that music, a particular, other than something very blatant, like someone's putting music in the, coin in the jukebox and this song is playing and those lyrics apply to what we're doing. That's different. But sort of a musical score note. And he says, yeah, you know what? It does happen more often than you would think. It doesn't happen a lot in a particular script. But if you're having a feeling that you think we need to feel, then go ahead and put it in there. We'll just read past it. And if we feel like it has a value, we'll leave it in there. If it doesn't, we'll have you pull it out. But there's tone of music. One of the ways you can study how scripts are written that's very interesting is to look at the subtitles of your favorite show on TV. Subtitles are, the words that go underneath, just in case you haven't turned that on in your lifetime. Okay. Well, you'll see things in brackets, which is a lot of the, it says ethereal music is playing and da-da-da-da. Well, maybe that's something you throw in your script if you want to really control the way this feels. 2 movies, which I'm not a giant fan of the stories, but I will say that the music and the scoring is as impeccable as it gets, would be Tron Legacy and Blade Runner 2049. I just recently rewatched Blade Runner 2049, and I had to take a phone call in the middle of the movie. It was being shown at my smoke shop. We bought the DVD so we could see it in 4K. But I had to take a phone call outside. I remember I was on the phone call and I was hearing the score inside, and it was just amazing. The textures, whoever did all that work really nailed it. It's hard to beat Vangelis from the 1982 version, but if you want to hear perfect music, just listen to the soundtrack of Blade Runner back in the day. But the new one is beautifully updated. I would give the guy an A+. Now, I've never read the script for 2049, but I don't know. Maybe that person, Hampton Fincher, decided to put those little notes in there to kind of control the way you're thinking about things. Someone needed to tell the director it was a noir genre that he blew apart with like 2,000 nit lights and half the sets, but whatever. As I've said before, I'm making these episodes because I want to see great things happen. In television, now the pay services are phenomenal. HBO, Starz, Amazon Prime, they're really coming up with some treasures. And yeah, they have a lot of junk in there as well, but whatever. It's someone attempting to make their dream come true. What might become an exercise of this particular episode, if you're an existing writer, and I don't care how professional you are, let's say you have a script that you wrote, people read it, never got bought, never got optioned, never got made. You might take what's in this episode, blow the dust off of it, reread it, just read it sitting in your backyard like I am right now. And keep notes, right? Write all over the damn thing and say, wow, I told the story, but I really didn't have much of a style at this early point in my career. And go back and rewrite the thing. Go back and rewrite it. If you want to be really extreme about it, open up in a nice iMac type monitor, landscape monitor, which is all the monitor these days. Put the old one on the right, put the new one on the left, and the one on the left is blank. And just retell the whole thing. Retell the whole thing from scratch. And you'll be amazed how much new stuff will occur to you, new twists, things you missed. I highly recommend, in order to get this polish to work, is you have to, I've got a buddy of mine who's a famous writer in Hollywood, very accomplished director, etc. And in his pastime, he turns wood. And this wood takes, he creates like vessels. He turns wood. He turns it and carves it down. And he taught me how to do it, and I've helped him do it. And I don't have the equipment in my house to do it, so I always have to visit him to pull this off. But he and I spent several years doing this together. But we have to get this big old chunky log, which is metaphorically your concept. And then we have to do all the coarse chiseling. Literally take the bark off the thing. You try to chainsaw most of it off, but then eventually it's got this big clunky thing, and you have to figure out where your center is and how you're gonna cut this thing. And you use these big ass chisels, gigantic ones, and you very carefully chisel off the thing as you turn it, and you start to get it to its general shape. Then you flip it around and you bore out the inside. Again, very coarse, but it's wood. And as you're turning wood, if you've never done it before, logs contain tremendous amounts of water if they're fresh. And the wood is just splattering water all over the wall. It's splattering you with it. You usually have to wear like almost a butcher's outfit to keep the water off your clothing. And you're just covered in shavings, and usually one of us chisels and the other one of us is sweeping out the stuff at the same time. And then we have to put it in wheelbarrows and toss it in the back, and then we have to literally use a leaf blower and blow it all outside. It's quite a process, but you can't finish the vessel the first day. You can't, because something happens to it. It dries, and when it dries, it warps, and so you have this beautiful symmetrical vessel at first, and then you have to put it in a special bag that absorbs water. It's a very thick bag with some padding in it, and it's designed to suck the water into the bag. And you put it on a shelf, and he's got hundreds of these things stacked on the shelf, and it warps like crazy, and it just sits there for a year, and they're all numbered and dated, right? So we know which ones have been up there, and sometimes he leaves them out there for 2 years. And you pull it out of the bag, And it's all twisted, turns, dry as a rock. It's hard as cement. And you put it all back on the lathe. And now you may initially use some of the bigger chisels, but over time you start going down to your finer chisels. And you just beautifully hone this thing out as best you can. You rebore out the inside and you thin it to as much as you possibly can, because when you first put it in the bag, it's pretty thick because it's going to warp and twist. You're going to need that girth to work with the vessel. And then what do? We sand it. And the sanding takes forever. But that's where the magic really comes in. The overall tone of the vessel starts to show up. And then we might stain it. And then we polish it. And then it's done. And it is a work of art. That process of putting it away in the bag is sort of a heartbreaking experience when you do it. Because you just worked your butt off getting it to that initial shape. And you can't do anything about it. You have to wait a year. You have to. It's a natural biological process of pulling out the water. But boy, the satisfaction you get when you get to go through the final stages, and usually the sanding can happen another 6 months after you kind of bore it out and get it all cleaned up after it's dried. Maybe you haven't made the decision about how you want to actually stain this thing. You want to think about it a little while. Maybe you're going to inlay 2 different vessels in on each other. There's all kinds of options you can do. Your script is the same thing. When you're writing, unless you are an absolute super duper professional, and sometimes you don't have the luxury of having what I'm about to say. And the gentleman who wrote Force Awakens for the Star Wars franchise, if you watch him in the making of, he'll tell you he only got 1.5 years to write this unbelievable rebirth of one of the most massive franchises to exist in film history. Maybe the biggest saga ever told in film. And you could see the pain on his face. He goes, I usually take 2 years to write a script, and I only got 1.5 years. And there was a design by committee going on at the same time, so his input was obviously most likely severely hobbled as they try to grab every demographic in the world and put it in the script, policing every word that he said, all of his prose. But sometimes we get too close to our scripts. Too close, and we no longer can register consciously our style, our tone. As a writer, you will get to a point where you can see your whole script in 1 second. It's just like an image that's worth 1,000 words or 10,000 words or 100,000 words. So you have to put it away for a little while. Go on to another script. That's why I'm usually writing 2 scripts at once and then incubating a third. So one's in scene outline mode, and the other 2 are usually in some form of dialogue or full writing mode. When I wrote Kukulkan, I was done in 2011. And, the project went cold because Chris Hemsworth got the Huntsman reboot, the Huntsman sequel all by himself. And his agent basically said, you can't be playing a bunch of these Conan kind of characters. And so they basically chose the Huntsman over this project we were working on, which was his concept to do. And so that whole thing, the whole thing dried up. I don't think he'll ever see that script in his lifetime. The new one I did. So I blew the dust off the thing 2 years ago. Actually, probably about 1 year ago, I guess. And I spent last year rewriting it from scratch. I mean, gutting scenes, throwing things out, putting new things in. And I just personally wanted my child to be fully grown because I had written it hastily. And, I was embarrassed actually when I got back to the version I had put down. But the thing we pitched to the studios was a treatment, thank God. Only a few people ever saw the script. But I rewrote this thing, and I think it turned out extremely well. I introduced new characters. I had characters that I introduced beautifully, wrote a few scenes for them, intended them to make it to the end of the script, and I completely forgot them. So I went back and totally re-engineered them. I sat pacing in my living room for hours debating one page of dialogue because it was that important to me. And I literally, in the prose, I had gods talking to men and trying to pass on an extremely important turn in the script. And it was heavy. But I got done with it and handed it into my agent. And I told him, I said, look, this is just something on the side here that I want you to see, that I can write this different style, and it's based on me researching lore, so that shows another talent of mine, blah, blah, blah. Not really handing it in to be pitched anywhere. Although apparently a lot of people want to make this script. I mean, they want to make the story, not my script. But I had it I had it finished, and it's been finished for probably a good 10 months now. And what was interesting about it was, about a month ago, it dawned on me that I had missed a very, very powerful scene that I just completely didn't conceive of. And the scene, I can actually share it with you, is that Cuchulainn is like a Jesus-type character 2,500 years before Jesus, as I've said a few times in my other screenwriting episodes. So he's a demigod. He has a father who's a god, and his mother was like a Mary, but she was the sister of the king. So she's born through the virgin womb of a young teenage, like a 14-year-old sister of the king. And so again, that's why I tell you all the time that the virgin birth arc is all over the place before Christ ever existed, or is rumored to have existed, let's put it that way. So I tell this whole story where he is banished to Alba, which is Scotland, roughly. He gets trained by this woman, Lady Sackhoff, and he fetches his boon. He figures out how to master who he is. She's a mystic. She runs him through all the tests. She selfishly uses him to dominate her own agenda. In the end, she loses her whole empire because of what she believes to be her selfishness with his powers. And so eventually he's sent back home to defeat the Queen Mev, who is now in a total brawl to take over all of Ireland. She has effectively taken over all of Ireland. The king is in hiding, and he has to come back and take the whole place back. And through all of your perceived, and this is a story that's told, I had to adhere to the overall big touch points that he wins. He basically takes back Ireland. But there's a point in the story where a very sad thing occurs, which I won't share just in case this thing ever gets made. But he's standing with the king, and he's had a horrible life. He's had a wonderful life and a horrible life, but mostly horrible. But he knows who he is. He's got all those powers, and he was unable to stop this really unfortunate incident from happening where someone dies. So he's standing looking at the pyre where the body's burning on the wood. And it's sort of burned all the way down now. And he's standing with his king, and he's just burned out. He's like, he doesn't want this life anymore. He doesn't want this battle anymore. He just wants to get married, have kids, and live a normal life. He has his lover back. This girl that he fell in love with when he was a kid. Before he got banished, he came back. He reunited with her. Things are kind of looking up. He's got one more battle to go. He doesn't want it. He fears he'll die. And the scene I had forgot to put in the script was, at some point he should meet his mother, his real birth mother, because he was taken from his birth mother and given to a farmer to be raised because they weren't sure if he was an omen or a blessing. And he turned into what they think was an omen. That's why he got banished, because he has this thing that happens to him because he's half God and half man. But it dawned on me. I got so close to the script, I'd forgotten this pivotal, at least this touching, amazing scene that the mother of this boy, who's now a man, had never been able to even touch the cheek of her own son. It's a very touching scene. I haven't written it yet on paper, but I've totally written it in my brain. But she's an old woman now. And I'm not sure, exactly how I'm going to make him react to it, because he's estranged from her. He doesn't seem to walk around missing her because he never knew he had a mom in the first place, really. So that's how close you can get to a script and miss something beautiful, which is why I got to put these things away and pull them out, reread them. It's your writing. You should probably enjoy what you write. If your story is worth telling and you read it again and it sounds like crap, like my experience, well, write it again. When you go to your grave, you'll be like, well, at least my children have been manicured beautifully. And maybe someone will find them and maybe someone will make them. Wouldn't that be nice? Most parents want their kids to get married and have kids. If you leave your kid with a lopsided face, maybe that won't happen, So get in there and straighten everything out. Give them the best chance they have to flourish by pouring your heart and soul into these things. If you are a writer, I'll just bumper it with some principles here that I go by. And I apply this to all things that people say that their passions are all about. If you're a writer, you don't need anyone to tell you to write. You don't need fame or money to write. It is just something you have to do. I enjoy making these shows a lot. It's so multidimensional why I love these shows. The byproduct that is probably the most rewarding is one of you watching it and enjoying it and letting me know. It's cool. I don't necessarily make the shows for you as much as I love your reactions to them. I make them because I have to. These are concepts that I want to share with the planet. When it comes to writing, I've had a very difficult journey getting people to actually teach me their tricks. And even teachers covet. Some people hold out to sell you their services because they got to make a living. I understand that. Trust me. I respect that. But I think that out of all professions, and I'm going to loop back on this passion thing in just a second, you're going to feel better if you share everything you possibly can. Again, if 10 years from now, one of you sells a film and I get to go watch it, and you send me a little email and you say, dude, I was packing groceries when I first heard your episodes on screenwriting, and I got into the art. I followed your suggestions. I went and got McKee's stuff and a few other people's stuff, took a course online or whatever, maybe went back to college to learn it, but I cranked out this film and it got made. I probably don't even care if I like the film or not. I'm just going to feel so happy that you got your dream that I'm going to relish in it. It's going to be fantastic. So that's sort of why I'm putting these things out there. No one's going to look at this thing, oh, that guy's an expert. They're just not going to do that. I'm just this dude on YouTube, whatever. It's unimportant to me. But, like I've said several times in other episodes, especially I think one on how to be an artist. If something is your passion, again, I should be able to go to your house, your dwelling, your domicile, and find your passion everywhere. If you're a painter, then the art on your wall, as much as you might enjoy putting up someone else's creation, should have your creation all over the place. You should surround yourself with at least your latest gallery. If you paint so much that you've got hundreds of stuff, well, you might want to share it with the world, sell it off, brighten someone else's day. But it should be everywhere around you, whatever it is you do. Maybe technically it's all throughout your hard drive. I don't print my scripts out and put them on my walls, of course. But if you looked around my house, you would find printed scripts here and there. I don't print my stuff as much as I used to. I probably should. I hate printer technology. Just all the cartridges that dry up inside the thing. You haven't even used your printer yet. And it's like, I'm out of ink. And it's like, I only printed 2 pages. Yeah, well, I evaporate while you're not there. Give me $40. It's like feeding this little monster, right? Think about how you're writing. Develop styles. Some people write the same kind of thing all the time. And so like a Tarantino, even though he's jumping around between World War II and the 1800s and modern day gangster films, the brother has a style. And, if someone put I'd say 2 minutes of prose from a movie, dialogue, and you showed me 20 minutes of random films, and you told me that secretly one of these is a Tarantino film, I'll probably stop you in 30 seconds and go, that's the one. Unless someone is trying to mimic that guy and copy his style, as long as every writer is being true to their own style, I'm going to see a Tarantino film in 2 seconds and go, that's him. And I'll be right. And you would be able to do the same thing, I'm sure. So in the end, I think that you want that capability with your audience, that they can see and feel what you've written. Steven Spielberg used to have a tone. And between Close Encounters, Poltergeist, Indiana Jones, they had this polished on them that was just special. Of course, John Williams helps quite a bit. All the production designers help. But this is back when studios used to keep employees for 30, 40 years. And everyone had their style. And they could homogenize their employment together and go, well, I take it to this stage, and then that person takes it to the next stage, and then the director takes it to that stage, and then post-production takes it to that stage, and it all feels like a universal picture. It feels like an MGM picture. And so that used to be why films were fantastic. And now everybody's subcontracted out, and so things feel weird and discombobulated. That's why you can have a great looking film, a great sounding film, but the story is atrocious. We played Blade Runner 2049 and some guys walked out of the middle of the film. We were 2/3 through the film. And one of the guys, who's very intelligent, just said, you know, man, I can't figure out what the hell's going on in this film. I'm out of here. Poof, walked out the door. Another guy just walked out because he's bored to death. You can make something look great, sound great. Special effects can be great. That story sucks. Everyone is just as bored as if you spent $2 on the production. Remember the Blair Witch Project? I never saw the film all the way through. But it grabbed a lot of people because the story was good. It was freaky. It was weird. It was produced in a weird way. How many old indie films turn into absolute cult classics? The story was good. That's all you need. Remember that old stage play, The Gin Game? With the husband and wife that played the two roles? The story was so rich, the whole thing happened on a set that was on stage, filmed. That was the movie. And it was just two people playing gin, rummy, on a fold-out table with fold-out chairs. But the dialogue was so unbelievable. You had a tone to the whole experience as it was over, but each second to second, the style was so good. The grumpy old man was constantly getting frustrated because the old lady he taught the old lady how to play the game, and she immediately just starts kicking his ass, and he just keeps blowing up. And in real life, they're husband and wife, which makes it even better. But she was sweet and round and soft, and he was sharp and jagged and, aggro. You want to create those kind of characters. Individually, you could pull a character out of a film, or two characters out of the film, and just between the two of them. Think about Pulp Fiction. I probably could watch 2 hours of just Samuel L. Jackson and John Travolta driving around in a car, making stops and just talking. I bet Tarantino could write that script, and I'd be totally mesmerized and watch it over and over and over and buy it. The more beautiful you make your experience, the more people want to see your film over and over again. And the key gem with that in the studio is they see asses in seats. They see people buying the rental. They see people buying the actual digital version of it to download. And it's something they can sell off to Netflix every 6 months or whatever for free on Netflix, with your subscription. But Netflix will pay them $10 million to have the film in their feed. Because overall, it will generate subscriptions that will pay the money back. That's where you become an economic benefit to the studios and everyone in the food chain. It is a business. Do not forget that. But if you write a great story and you stay true to yourself, the business will arrive. You don't want to become a musician because you want to be famous. You want to become a musician because music is what you do. The fame and the money, that'll come with it. Don't worry about it. So anyway, I hope you felt this was useful to you. Love to hear your comments. If you've gone through the entire screenplay playlist, which probably 7 or 8 videos at this point, if I'm missing something huge that you constantly run into as an obstacle, please let me know in this description, and I'll make a whole video about that one thing. Or if nothing else, I'll comment to you to hopefully get you over that hurdle. I want you to succeed. I want to see your film, your television show, whatever it is, your book, whatever. Let me know. Anyway, if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, it's been totally redesigned, much easier to find, search field, category list, all the episodes are in there. Season 1 has been completely remastered with a lot of fixes to the audio, a lot of editing that will make the episodes go a little bit quicker. And there's a link to that on the top. There's also a link to all the video feeds, all the audio feeds, a couple places to donate. We have a couple social media outlets, Twitter, just has all the episodes listed when I started the account. I didn't list all the old episodes. Why do that? But we have a locked Facebook group with some amazing people as well. So, until the next episode, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.